The Suns worked out in those days at the Jewish Community Center, which was about a mile from where I lived, so I could walk there and back. So I was a regular at then coach John McLeod's basketball camp. The Suns players would come in and run drills with you. Probably the best thing I learned out of the course of being in those camps was working on a rebounding drill with a Suns forward named Curtis Perry, who played for the Suns back in those days. And the drill was to toss the ball off the backboard, catch it, and leap to one side of the lane, and then throw it off the backboard and leap to the other side of the lane. And as I threw the ball up towards the backboard, it went over the backboard and got stuck behind the backboard, at which point Curtis Perry turned to me and said, "Yeah, you're a guard."
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So we're all getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you made the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 71. Thanks for joining me. Today, I'm happy to welcome a new friend of the show, Adam Beechin. Our primary focus is the Phoenix Suns, more specifically how they were rebuilt from the ground up throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, culminating with their 1993 NBA Finals appearance. We begin by covering the franchise's inception, the 1968-69 season, and its first decade of existence, particularly the iconic 1976 squad and their most unlikely appearance in the NBA Finals. We also discussed the wonderful Tom Leander documentary, perfectly titled Cinderella Suns, based on the aforementioned 1976 team. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my monthly email newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming podcast episodes, future high-profile guests to appear on the show, and much more. Simply visit inallairness.com/news. Show notes for this episode, including links to numerous topics covered, are at inallairness.com/71. Now, on to the show. Today, I welcome a true Phoenix Suns superfan to the show. We'll get to that later in our conversation. Our main topic of discussion will focus on how the Suns franchise was rebuilt from the ground up throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, and culminating with the 1993 NBA Finals appearance. Adam Beechin, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Thanks very much, mate. It's great to have you on, and we've been conversing via email for the best part of 2 years now, so it's great to finally be able to have a chance to speak with you rather than just type back and forwards.
Same here. It's nice to know you really exist.
I do exist. I'm not just a figment of your imagination or my own either, so that's good to know. Now, I've gone back through our email history and I've picked up a few bits and pieces which I'd love to touch on, and then we'll just chat about whatever comes to mind, I guess, from there on. But you first discovered the Phoenix Suns during the 1976 season, I believe, when you were about 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
That year, the Suns made their first trip to the NBA Finals, and they entered the league in the 68-69 season. So how did you first get into the Suns? Were you watching them on TV? Did you get to go to some of their games in person? How did it sort of develop to begin with?
Well, the Suns at that time were the only professional franchise in town in Phoenix. There wasn't a hockey team there yet. There wasn't a football team or a baseball team yet. So everything was about the Suns. And so we followed them pretty religiously in my house. And my dad would even tell me Phoenix Suns themed bedtime stories. So I was a pretty big fan from a very young age. And then when they went on their incredible playoff run in 76, winding up playing the Boston Celtics in the finals, one of the greatest finals ever, it was hard not to pay attention to what was going on. And that team was such a big underdog going into that finals that it was impossible not to root for them. You couldn't help but fall in love with that team because they had no chance against the, at that time, 11-time champion Boston Celtics. And there they were, pushing them to 6 games.
It was pretty incredible. And that 1976 team was lovingly referred to as the Cinderella Suns. And I've just recently managed to watch via the Suns.com website. They've got the documentary of the same name, Cinderella Suns, on demand. And that was absolutely fantastic. Probably the best 30 minutes I've spent watching anything NBA related this year. So have you had a chance to see that doco as well?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I was waiting for that one to come out. This is the 40th anniversary of that team.
True.
And they honored the team a couple of weeks ago in Phoenix, and they had most of the players there and the coaches that were part of that franchise. And it was really something to see the highlights of. I wish I could have been there in person.
And some of the footage that they brought out, just archival footage, was remarkable, particularly as the Suns got back and arrived into Phoenix, going through the airport, and it was just absolute scenes of bedlam. Like it was almost like the Beatles had arrived to do a concert or something, because they were treated like absolute rock stars. It was just fantastic to watch, and I'm sure it must have brought back some incredible memories for yourself, I guess, as a young child growing up.
Absolutely. I wish I could have been there for that at Sky Harbor Airport. It was a little past my bedtime, but I certainly saw the pictures of it. I had never seen footage of it before this documentary. The fashions are somewhat questionable, but the enthusiasm on everybody's part is undeniable. There were like 5,000 people there, and it was a small airport at the time. They blocked the roads getting into and out of the airport. There were too many people in the building. It was chaos, but it was a happy chaos.
Fantastic, and I can't recommend that highly enough. And I think Tom Leander put together the documentary, so congratulations to him and whoever else was assisting with that, because it was just some remarkable footage from many years ago. As you said, 40-year anniversary just gone a few weeks ago. Yeah,
I think Tom really scoured the vaults, and he's a true Suns historian, and that was a labor of love for him, because I think he began being a fan of the Suns at about the same time, maybe even earlier.
All right. I'd love to actually have a chance to speak with him at some stage down the line. We'll hopefully get him on the show and love to chat about that particular piece of work that he put out. Now, you mentioned as well in a couple of emails that we had back and forwards that you attended some Suns practices and went to a couple of the basketball camps and things like that in your younger years.
Oh, yeah.
Do you mind just regaling a few of those memories that you might have about that time as well?
The Suns worked out in those days at the Jewish Community Center, which was about a mile from where I lived, so I could walk there and back. So I was a regular at then-coach John McLeod's basketball camp for youngsters. I was one of the younger ones. The Suns players would come in and run drills with you. You'd scrimmage. Coach was there barking orders and telling you where to go and how best to do things. It was a great education. Probably the best thing I learned out of the course of being in those camps was working on a rebounding drill with a Suns forward named Curtis Perry, who played for the Suns back in those days. And the drill was to toss the ball off the backboard, catch it, and leap to one side of the lane, and then throw it off the backboard and leap to the other side of the lane. And as I threw the ball up towards the backboard, it went over the backboard and got stuck behind the backboard, at which point Curtis Perry turned to me and said, "Yeah, you're a guard."
Well, it takes particular skill, though, to get the ball wedged up above the backboard, so at least take solace in that.
I was really athletically gifted, yeah.
Oh, that's funny. So did you have an absolute favourite player on the Suns roster during that 1970s or into the 80s?
Yeah. The year after the Suns played for the championship against the Celtics, they drafted a guy named Ron Lee. And Ron was out of the University of Oregon, and he was known as the Kamikaze Kid when he came to the Suns because he did nothing but dive on the floor for loose balls. He spent more time probably lying on the floor than he did actually running around on the floor. And Ron had the biggest afro I'd ever seen in my entire life, and he had a very infectious smile and a great personality. And I even got to meet him when I was a little kid. He presented awards to the Jewish Community Center basketball league that I was in. I have a photo of myself taken with him, and I'm completely in the shade of his afro. But he was my favorite. He was only on the Suns for about 2 years, but he has stuck with me as not just a favorite player, but also an example for when I used to play basketball of how hard to go every time there was a possession. It's good to hear those sort of stories about who someone's favorite player is, and it's good to hear it from you. Now, from here, more than happy to go with wherever you'd like to lead the conversation in terms of how the Phoenix Suns had gone from the heights of that 1976 finals to then hitting almost rock bottom during the 1980s and various scandals and whatnot and terrible tragedies, etc., and then built the team back up into the powerhouse that they became in the late 80s and into the early 90s before Charles Barkley even arrived in that 92-93 season. So where would you like to sort of go from here about how the team developed? Well, there's some interesting facts about the Suns that you may or may not know. They are the longest tenured NBA team to never win a championship. They have never had the number one pick in the draft. They've picked second twice. Now, I don't want to say there's some sort of fix that's in, but Cleveland has had, I think, 5 number one picks in the lottery era, and they've had 6 or 7 overall. So some teams have all the luck, and the Suns have not had a whole lot of luck as their 50-year history is, or however many years it is, that they've been around. So the amount of success they've had without having really good draft picks has been pretty remarkable. And most of it is a testament to Jerry Colangelo and the ownership of the Colangelos. When all the scandals happened in the mid to late 80s, there was talk of the team even leaving Phoenix. And what happened was Jerry Colangelo bought the team. He led a group of investors, bought the team with the express purpose of keeping it in Phoenix. And then there was the rebuilding process could really begin there.
And even when you're talking about some of the misfortune that the team had along the way, they also had the unfortunate circumstance of missing out on the coin flip, which could have led to them securing one Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Lou Alcindor, I guess, at that stage.
Yeah.
So if it had gone the other way, perhaps, the NBA's all-time leading scorer could have been a Phoenix Sun. Who knows actually what may have come about. Changes the whole course of the NBA's history, I guess, when you think about it that way.
It could have, yeah, for sure. And the team he would have joined was probably stronger than the Milwaukee team that he joined. And who knows, he left Milwaukee to go to Los Angeles because Milwaukee at that time was a pretty small city and didn't have a lot of cultural diversity. And he was looking for more of that. And so he really wanted to be traded to New York. They couldn't work that out. And so he was traded back to the city where he went to college. And the rest is history. In that coin flip, which was the first coin flip for the number one pick in the NBA, the Suns finished second, of course, and they picked Neil Walk, who passed away last year. Unfortunately, Neil Walk was a center out of the University of Florida, and he actually averaged 20 points and 12 rebounds one year. So he was nobody's consolation prize.
Just judging by our conversation already and all the email history we've had, I obviously can tell you've got a great history and background in basketball, of course, and reading up. You said, I think at one stage you've got upwards of 40 or 50 different biographies of different players or teams or things along the way that you've consumed as well. So that's obviously helped develop your love for the NBA and the history of the game as well.
Yeah, I got involved with the Suns in 75, 76, and immediately I wanted to know what had happened before that. That got all the players there, and that led to wondering about the NBA in those years. And then it's just been a matter of finding out as much as I could about the history of the NBA from about the mid-60s on. And I have a lot of books and a lot of videos and a lot of time spent on basketballreference.com checking out stats and players.
I think I am almost obligated to say the basketballreference.com website address in every episode that I'm recording, but I say it with true love for it because it's a remarkable website without which I wouldn't be able to do nearly as much research as I can about these particular people I chat to and also the topic-based episodes as well. So it's an incredible resource.
It's a dream for basketball fans. It really is.
Yeah. Now, I think you may have mentioned that Terry Pluto's book, Loose Balls, was right up there with one of your favourite books that you've ever read.
Yeah.
You've got a love for the ABA as well as the NBA. So would that be your number one book, you reckon, the Terry Pluto's, or goes very close?
I think that's the best basketball book I've ever read. It's either that or David Halberstam's book about the Blazers in the late 70s, The Breaks of the Game. But the great thing about the Terry Pluto book is that not many people know about the ABA. There wasn't a lot of television coverage. Not a lot of footage survives. It's mostly oral tales that are passed down from people to people. And Pluto's book is all oral history. It's all from the people who lived it, who were there for the ABA. And the stories they tell are amazing. Some of them are hilarious. Some of them are pretty sad, but all of it is unbelievable. And it's stuff that I didn't know about growing up. I never knew what the ABA was. Yeah, it's
still to this day, it's fairly unknown, really,
the
majority of the history of it. The book obviously sheds a lot of light on what was happening during that time, but it still seems to fall between the cracks of what actually people know about the history of the game, and the ABA is largely, it's a bit of a grey area that no one really can talk about with some conviction. So it's good to hear that there's still people plenty interested in the ABA back in that time.
I think that the average fan, probably if they know anything about the ABA, it's that Dr. J came from the ABA. And he was the one who really put the league on the map and brought about the merger of the ABA and the NBA. But there are so many great players that came out of the ABA that it's really worth reading about them and finding out who they were, because they had a great impact on the entire sport.
Yep, helped it definitely going forwards for sure. Now, if I got my timeline right, you attended university in Illinois during the maybe mid to late 80s?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep, at Northwestern University?
Yes.
So you were living in Illinois. This is during Jordan's first 4 or 5 seasons in the NBA. What was it like to be living near Chicago maybe only, an hour's drive, if not even that, to Chicago from where you were, and sort of following the Jordan years as he developed and became even more of a superstar in the late 80s.
It was an interesting time for the Bulls because those were the years when they couldn't quite get past the Pistons. Most of the media coverage around sports in Chicago at that time were centered around Jordan because there had never been anything like him. So you really couldn't, walk 2 feet without running into somebody talking about Michael Jordan. And he didn't have the best supporting cast in those days, but it was starting to get better. They were starting to bring in people like Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant. Bill Cartwright came in by trade, and you could tell that something was building there. The question was, were they going to have a long enough window to get past the Pistons? So a lot of the conversation in Chicago was about that and about how much everybody there hated the Detroit Pistons.
Well, that's understandable, I guess, because even from over here in Australia, the standard story is that Detroit and Chicago were bitter rivals and arch enemies for a majority of the late 80s and certainly into the early 90s as well, as they battled.
Yeah.
Chicago had to overcome Detroit. First, they were sort of blocked by Boston in the earlier years, and then it led to the Detroit years, and then they got over Detroit, and then that's when they became the championship team, which everybody knows now. But around this sort of same time in the mid-80s to late 80s, the Phoenix franchise was really beginning to rebuild itself all over again. So what do you sort of recall from, or what have you learnt from reading all these different books, etc., about how the Suns began to transform themselves after these drug scandals, but not to mention the death of a very promising, albeit a project player, projected to have some great impact on the team, who was tragically killed?
Yeah, Nick Vanos was a center, and the Suns were really high on him. And the Suns, for most of their history, had never really had a true center. They had been known up to that point as being a precision team that loved to run, but they weren't. You could push them around. And Nick Vanos was a 7'2" guy out of Santa Clara, and a big guy and really promising offensive talent. And they were excited about him. And unfortunately, he was killed along with a lot of other people in a plane crash in Detroit. So that was a real setback for the franchise and for the community, really. But then after that, there was a drug scandal. A number of players were implicated in a series of drug arrests. None of the players were ever convicted. But the fact that their names came out in the press was really tough on the organization and tough on the community. The Suns had to sort of purge themselves of those players and that sort of sense in the community before they could start coming back again. It was a couple of years that were really, really hard.
Obviously tragic stuff to try and deal with, to say the least. Now, it was about almost 2 years ago in an email, I went back over our history today, that you said that you were at the 1988 Suns draft headquarters, and that was the night that they selected a guy named Dan Marley from Central Michigan University, pick number 14 in the 88 draft. You mentioned how you've got some vivid memories of that particular night and all the surrounding atmosphere. Can you maybe just relay some of the experiences that you had in that particular NBA draft day? Sure.
I was interning for a local news station in the sports department. So I got to go with the crew to the draft headquarters, which at that time were in a hotel in Phoenix, and was there for the draft. And so Jerry Colangelo was up on the podium with Cotton Fitzsimmons, who was the coach at the time. Paul Westphal was an assistant coach at the time. And the place was filled with fans and with media people. At one point, I think one of the Suns announcers, not Al McCoy, the regular radio voice, but I think one of the television announcers, he must have thought that I was working for the hotel because he asked me to get him a Coke. So I did, and I went across the room, I got him a Coke, I came back, I handed it to him, he gave me a $5 tip. So I remember that pretty well. I don't think I still have the $5, but I remember it pretty well. But when it came time for the Suns to draft, their first pick that night was at, I think, number 7. And they picked a guy named Tim Perry, who was a very athletic forward out of Temple. And then they had another first-round pick that year at 14, and they picked Dan Marley. And when Dan Marley's name was announced, the crowd booed because no one had ever heard of Dan Marley. He played at a very small school, like you mentioned, Central Michigan. He was a 6'6" center playing there. And I don't think anybody in Phoenix knew, A, who he was, or B, what they were going to do with him. And Cotton Fitzsimmons said after the booing, he said, "You're going to regret the day you ever booed this young man." And he was right. Marley didn't play a lot in his first year because he had, I think he had mono. But when he came back and really joined the team, he was the kind of player that every team wants. He was an energy guy, a glue guy, a guy who would guard the other team's toughest player. It was great to have him on the team.
Yeah, and since then, of course, Marley's now a member of what is known as the Suns Ring of Honor.
Yeah.
I think it was 2003 when I checked up the dates of it today that he was inducted into the Ring of Honor, and that just sort of acknowledges the contributions that a player or an individual has made to the Suns organisation. So it went from being a who's Dan Marley and booing to actually having him as one of their favourite Suns. No pun intended, of course.
And he's actually still part of the community. He was an assistant coach for the Suns for a lot of years, and now he coaches at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix. He has a restaurant downtown that's very popular. He's very much in the community's eye.
From here, what would you like to chat about as far as how the Suns continue to develop their roster sort of going forwards into the late 1980s, even into the early 90s? I know that they had a very good playoff win over the LA Lakers when it came to the 1990 NBA playoffs. I think I'm just going from memory here, but I think it was a 5-game series. They defeated the Lakers. So that was a sign of obviously a great young team building up and becoming a very prominent fixture in the Western Conference. So what do you sort of recall from those years as you were watching it happen, and even what you've read since? What sort of impact have those players and that team made to this day?
There was a little bit of a lead up to that.
Mm-hmm.
Even before the draft of Marley, the previous season, the Suns had exactly one asset left. They had Larry Nance, who was a very good player, and they traded him. They traded him to Cleveland. And in exchange for him, they got essentially Mark West, who became their starting center for a lot of years. They got Tyrone Corbin, who was a swingman who helped them out a lot in his year or two with the Suns. And they got a guy named Kevin Johnson. And they projected Kevin Johnson to be their point guard of the future. And the Suns already had Jeff Hornacek at that point, so they thought they had a pretty good backcourt going forward. I don't think they knew just how good a backcourt they had going forward, but those were really the guys that were the anchors of the team for the next 3 or 4 years. The Suns traded for Eddie Johnson, the well-known shooting ace. I think you've had him on your podcast.
Sure have. Great guy to chat to, and yeah, obviously a key member of the Suns back at that time as well.
Yeah, and then the final piece to that really was that they signed Tom Chambers. And Chambers was the first, I think, unrestricted free agent in NBA history. And they signed him for a lot of money. And it was sort of a curious choice at the time. He was a great offensive player, and he was really like the first stretch four that you hear about, a guy who could shoot from way outside but also take the ball inside and really spread the floor. But he didn't have the greatest public relations persona at the time. He was known for not smiling. He was known for being kind of a cranky individual. So from a public relations standpoint, it was kind of a curious choice for the Suns coming off of all those scandals. But he proved to fit so well with KJ. They were doing the pick and roll, and they were getting it going just about the same time as Stockton and Malone, and they were just as unstoppable.
So I wasn't overly aware of Tom Chambers' perceived nature off the court, perhaps. When I've seen footage of him on, NBA games and whatever else and being interviewed and whatnot, he seems like a likable, friendly character. And, of course, now he's part of the Suns TV broadcasting team. Studio shows are on location, and he seems like a great personality. So that's interesting that you raised that he wasn't quite known as much as that in the 1980s.
Well, I like to think that he was welcomed by the community, and once he saw how welcome he was, he sort of opened himself up to the community. I have no idea if that's true. That's what I like to think.
Yeah.
And obviously he started to produce for the Suns the minute he stepped on the court. And the Suns had been so bad for so long that to see a quality NBA player out there really doing stuff that a lot of other players couldn't do, I think he found a home pretty quickly.
And it's remiss of me not to mention, given we're talking about Tom Chambers, we have to quickly chat about that incredible monster dunk he threw down on Mark Jackson. That's just one of the most remarkable dunks you'll ever see. He almost elevated higher off Jackson when he made contact with him. Do you recall at the time, even when that dunk happened, or it's only been sort of turned into the legendary status it has because of all the NBA entertainment videos and highlights?
When you saw that dunk, you knew it was one for the ages. And they replayed it on sports broadcasts in Phoenix for, I think, about a week. Just over and over and over again. And I couldn't get enough of it. It's on YouTube. If anybody wants to find it, it's one of the great dunks of all time. And it's Chambers, who was 6'10", coming down the lane with only Mark Jackson between him and the hoop. And Mark Jackson was 6'4". And Chambers went up and basically kneed Mark Jackson in the face, and then went up higher, got his elbows above the rim and threw it down. And it was just amazing to see. He was a spectacular player. He really was in his prime.
Of course, he lit it up in the 1987 All-Star game and was named MVP, I think even as a replacement player at short notice.
That's right. I think it was in Seattle for whom he was playing at the time.
Correct, yeah. So that was quite a remarkable turn of events for him to be put in the game at short notice and then come out with MVP honours. So good stuff there from Tom Chambers. So as the team began to get more and more cohesive as a unit, they were more and more challenging through the late 80s, and then getting into the 1990 season, that's when they then upset the LA Lakers, you'd have to say. I mean, that was quite a big upset to dispose of them. I think Phoenix were the lower seeded team.
They were.
Do you have many memories of that playoff run where the Lakers got put out much earlier than they would have expected?
Oh, yeah, that was a huge deal in Phoenix. The Suns had been the Lakers' little brother for a lot of years, and the Lakers had stomped perennially on the Suns, particularly during the Showtime years. I think the Suns always considered the Lakers their great rivals. The Lakers could have cared less about the Suns, of course. It was all about the Celtics. But for the Suns to beat the mighty Lakers that year was a really huge deal. And the Suns had tinkered with their lineup getting to that point to try and find the right mix of players. They traded Eddie Johnson for Xavier McDaniel because they felt like they needed more toughness. That didn't really work out. They signed Kurt Rambis as a free agent power forward, and Ed Neely, former Bull.
And former podcast guest. I've got to get that in there as well. So
that's right. Great podcast, that one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Those guys helped the Suns a lot by not being guys who needed the ball, but were willing to do the dirty work. And they helped the Suns really improve from year to year to the point where they were able to beat the Lakers. And then the Suns were sort of in the place that the Bulls were in at the exact same time, where the Bulls couldn't get past the Pistons. The Suns were stymied either every year by the Lakers or by the Blazers. So it was a question of what was going to put them over the top. What was the one thing that they were missing?
And another player who was introduced to the Suns team around this time as well, and he's also a former podcast guest, dare I say. The shameless self-promotion, mate, is off the charts today. But it's Cedric Ceballos.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a great former guest on the show, and he opened up about his time in Phoenix and how the franchise sort of matured as it progressed into the early 1990s and approaching that 1993 season, which we'll get to shortly. But I know that you mentioned in a previous email correspondence about you managed to be sitting baseline underneath the basket support at a Phoenix home game when the 1991 Chicago Bulls came to town for their only visit that season in Phoenix. Can you maybe just talk about that experience? You shared with me a couple of great little photos that you took from the baseline view you had, and one Michael Jeffrey Jordan was close by, I think guarded by Hornacek at the time in that photo you sent me. So some great memories there, perhaps?
Was buddies with a guy who was working for the company that did Suns videos. They were sort of outsourced to this small company, and he was working for the company at that time. And when the Bulls were coming to town, he asked me if I wanted to go. I said, sure. And he said, great, we'll get you a pass to sit with the photographers on the baseline underneath the basket. And I said, what? And he said, you're going to be on the baseline. I said, okay. So I was technically the assistant to the cameraman who was working the game, but I knew nothing about whatever it was he needed. So I was of no help to him. But I brought a small camera with me, was able to take some of my own pictures while I was there. But mostly I was able to watch the game. And the Bulls, it was their first championship team, and they were spectacular. And the Suns were a great team, but there was some question about whether or not they could hang with a team like the Bulls. And to be that close to the action and see the guys up that close, to really get a sense of the size of them and how much talking goes on during the game, and to hear all that stuff firsthand was amazing. And the Suns actually won that game on a last-second shot by KJ. And I've recently come across a DVD of that game and watched it again for the first time since I was actually there, and I got just as excited watching it as I did at the time.
It would have brought back some incredible memories, I guess, watching it retrospectively, knowing that you were sitting along the baseline there.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the box score now, dare I say it, on basketballreference.com, and Jordan had 34 points. If it's the same game I'm thinking of, it's 109 to 107. The Suns won.
Yep.
Phoenix's leading scorer was Jeff Hornacek, who had 24. And as you said, KJ had the winning basket. He had 18 points and 10 assists. So a pretty stock standard, great game there from KJ. So, I can't imagine the sort of memories you still got to this day about that. But when you said that the guy that was involved with the Suns, as far as Suns videos and things at the time, do you know what sort of productions or pieces were put out about the Suns of that era in terms of any sort of documentaries at all about the team, or just little bit pieces here and there? Or
Well, I think at the time they were sending highlight films to the season ticket holders.
Okay.
In an effort to get them to renew. And then if there was some kind of special video that was needed for a Suns Charities event or some other appearance or whatnot, they would cut those together. So they were mostly putting together highlight packages.
Okay, cool. I'm always intrigued by that sort of stuff, as how that evolves and how the footage, like this archival footage, just comes out of nowhere. Every now and then you'll just see something remarkable. I say remarkable far too often, but you see all this footage and think, wow, like this has just been here for years. Where's it come from? Out of nowhere. So it's hard to believe.
I have vivid memories when I was in Suns basketball camp of the staffers showing us highlight films from the Suns in the early 70s. And I'm dying to know where that footage is. I would love to see it again. I can remember one dunk highlight from Connie Hawkins, the Hall of Famer who played for the Suns, over Wilt Chamberlain. That was so mind-blowing, I can still picture it. And I would love to see it again, but I can't find it anywhere. And I've asked the Suns about it. They're not sure what happened to that footage either. But I would love to see it again someday. I love that stuff.
Couldn't agree more with that. Now, before we sort of get to the time frame where Charles Barkley comes into the equation and the 1993 finals come around, is there anything from that period of time that we've discussed so far, or even well before, that springs to mind at all that you'd like to chat about?
Well, before I went to college in Chicago, I would go there on vacations to visit my father. My father lived downtown. Mm-hmm. And so one year for Christmas vacation when I was in high school, I went to Chicago. And we were walking into the building where my dad lived, and there was a small car parked out in front of the building. And it had a license plate that read Jump 23. And my dad said, "Oh, Michael's here." I said, "Michael? Michael who?" And he said, "Michael Jordan." I said, "No, come on. Really?" He said, "Yeah, he's got a friend who lives in the building, and occasionally he's here to visit. So he must be here." So I said, "Well, that's pretty cool. I've seen Michael Jordan's car." So we walk into the building, we go through the lobby, we get to the elevator, and one of the doors are about to close. The elevator is just leaving, and my dad says, "Hold the elevator." And this enormous hand comes out of the elevator and stops the door. And we walk around the corner into the elevator, and there's Michael Jordan. And it was the year that he had broken his foot. So he wasn't playing at that time. He was still rehabilitating. So he had a big cast on his foot or a big walking boot or what have you. Mm-hmm. And we're riding up in the elevator with Michael Jordan. And it's just the three of us. And being the stupid kid that I was, and still am, I decided I was not going to be the kid who fawned all over Michael Jordan. So I decided I wasn't going to say anything. Like he was going to remember me 20 years from now and say, "You remember that smart kid in the elevator who never talked to me?" But my dad had no problem talking to him. So he was asking Michael about his rehabilitation, how that was going. And he asked about Walter Davis, the Suns star, who was Michael's hero, really, when he was a kid. And at that time, Walter was having his problems with substance abuse. So he was talking to Michael about that. And then we got to our floor and we walked out and my dad said, "Good night, Michael." And Michael said, "Good night." And I said nothing. And I blew my chance to talk to Michael Jordan.
I think I would have been probably in the same boat. I wouldn't know what to say. I would have been just starstruck. So at least your dad
Unbelievable.
Had the presence of mind to strike up a conversation with him.
There's a follow-up to that story.
Oh, great.
After I moved to Los Angeles, I got involved with the Writers Guild of America. And the Writers Guild had a conference in Hawaii in the late 90s. And I went to sort of help out throwing the conference. And it was a nice hotel. And it was a hotel that a lot of celebrities and sports stars have stayed at. And it was the summertime, so a number of them happened to be there. I saw Al Michaels walking around on the beach. And anyway, a friend of mine was getting into an elevator at the hotel, and he walked in, and there was Michael Jordan. It was after the season. Michael was there vacationing. And so he gets in next to Michael Jordan. They're standing there, and the elevator goes up a floor, and a whole family gets in. Mother, father, daughter, son. And they are just looking up at Michael Jordan like he is the second coming. They are stunned. Their jaws are open. They can't believe it. And they're just staring at him for the entire elevator ride. And the elevator gets to their floor, and they get off. And my friend and Michael Jordan are still in the elevator together. The doors close, and my friend says, "Boy, I'm sure glad they didn't ask me for my autograph." And Jordan apparently just fell apart laughing. So I've got some fun elevator stories for Michael Jordan.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it must be something about elevators because, dare I hark back to another episode, but on a previous episode of the podcast with Jim McIlvaine, he referred to a run-in that he had with Gene Hackman.
Right.
In an elevator and talking about something about the movie Hoosiers that was a very funny story as well. So it must be something about elevators, mate, and basketball players in general. I didn't think I'd hear another elevator story, let alone two more. So thank you for sharing those ones.
Happy to add to your stockpile.
They're growing, ever growing. So I'm just trying to think how the Suns went in the 1991, 1992 playoff runs. They wouldn't have progressed past the first or second round, I don't think. I should have actually checked before I had the call, but
No, it's all right. In '92, they actually played the Blazers in, I think it was the conference semifinals.
Yep.
And that was a great Blazers team. That was Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter and Kevin Duckworth and Jerome Kersey. And that was a war. It was the last season for the Suns in their original home, Veterans Memorial Coliseum. And the noise in there got so loud that there's a great photo of Danny Ainge, who was actually playing for the Blazers at that time, with his fingers in his ears because he couldn't hear a thing. And the Suns made a heroic effort, but the Blazers were just a little bit better. And that was really what sealed the deal for the Suns. They knew they had to get tougher. They needed somebody who could really bang on the boards and was not going to take any crap from the other team. And so they went about getting the toughest guy in the league.
yeah, it's a great story, I guess, of how Barkley was forever trying to get his 76ers into the postseason and then deep into the postseason, but it never came to be as a member of the 76ers. And then, of course, you've got the 1992 Olympic Games happening, obviously just after the season had ended in 92 with the Bulls taking the championship over the Blazers. And then between that happening and then the 92-93 season starting, you've got Barkley signing with the Suns. You've got Paul Westphal at the helm now, and also you're moving into a new arena as well, America West Arena. So there was plenty of things to look forward to as the Suns entered that 92-93 season.
Yeah.
Regular season itself was great for the team, and it just continued to build as they worked their way towards the playoffs. And then before even getting to the finals, had that classic series against the LA Lakers as well, which went all 5 games in the first round.
Yeah, there's a ton of great stories about that season.
What takes your fancy? I'm happy to go wherever you want to lead.
Oh, sure. Well, the Barkley went to the Olympics and came back kind of on a mission to prove that he was every bit as good as Michael Jordan. So that was a goal of his throughout the course of that season. After the Suns traded for Barkley, and they traded a very popular player to get him. They traded Jeff Hornacek, along with Tim Perry, who we talked about earlier, and a backup center named Andrew Lang.
True.
They traded quite a bit for Barkley. I think there were some picks involved, too. And Charles came to the Valley, and he was walking around the new arena. This was before it ever opened, with Cotton Fitzsimmons. And they had just hung the banners, the few banners that the Suns had at the time, from the rafters and the retired numbers and the beautiful brand new arena. And Cotton said, "Do you see this arena, Charles?" And Charles said, "Yeah." And Cotton said, "You didn't build this. This was all happening before you got here. So you're joining an organization that already exists that is ready for you to come in and help." And he changed the entire character of that team. The team, by necessity, became built around Charles Barkley, which meant that Tom Chambers took a back seat and willingly came off the bench and was a really good reserve scorer for them. He was towards the end of his career at that point. He and KJ developed a pretty good kind of synergy. Dan Marley changed his game from being a down-the-lane scrapper to being a three-point shooter. And some of his outings that year were unbelievable from three-point range, especially in the finals. I'm sure you remember.
Yeah.
And then the Suns made the playoffs. They had the best record in the NBA. I think they were 62-20, which was the best they'd ever been. They got to the playoffs. They played the Lakers. The Lakers were in transition at that point, but Worthy was still there. Byron Scott was still there. The Suns lost the first 2 games to the Lakers. It was a best-of-5 series at that point. And Paul Westphal went to the press conference and said, "I guarantee you we're going to win this series. We're going to win the next game, and then we're going to win the game after that. Then we're going to come back home. We're going to win that game." It's exactly what happened.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, and I've tweeted about it a few times, and just personally, it's one of my favourite memories of anything in the NBA was seeing him at that press conference. He said something like, "It's been a great series, just we haven't enjoyed it too much so far."
Yeah.
And then said, as you just relayed, that they were going to win the following 2 games, come back home and win it. And I think it was an overtime win in Game 5 to finally get over the hump to put the Lakers away, who were the number 8 seed.
Yeah.
Incredible series to begin with, and almost upset the almost unbeatable Suns at that stage. So, yeah, great memories.
And at that time, no 8 seed had beaten a 1 seed. So it would have been really humiliating if the Suns had lost that series.
Yeah, this predates the Denver Nuggets upset of the Seattle Supersonics, which was a first-round shocker 1 year later. And you mentioned Paul Westphal, who in recent times, aside from being known probably more recently, of course, as a coach in the NBA, Sacramento, going back further, of course, to being with the Suns. He was a fantastic player in his own right, and I think he's possibly one of the more underrated players in the NBA's history, to be honest. I think he did some great things. Game 5 of the 76 finals, he was just incredible with some of the moves that he pulled off and some of the plays that he did, along with Alvin Adams, who's also another guy I've recently come to really admire in terms of their career paths and what they achieved as players as well. So maybe, do you mind just talking for a little bit about your memories of and thoughts on those two guys and the contribution they've made to the Phoenix Suns in general and just basketball more specifically?
Sure, yeah. No, they came to the Suns the same year. They came to the Suns in that 75-76 season. The Suns traded Charlie Scott who was a great player. They traded Charlie Scott to the Celtics to get Westphal. And Westphal was a backup guard for the Celtics in those years. And he was stuck behind John Havlicek. He couldn't get on the court. And Boston had spent a first-round draft pick on him, and they knew he was going to be a really good player. They couldn't find any time for him. So they wound up trading him to the Suns. And I don't think the Suns fans really knew who Paul Westphal was at that point, but he got to Phoenix, and then the Suns had drafted Alvin Adams, who had been recruited by Coach John McLeod when Coach John McLeod was at Oklahoma. And Alvin was a 6'9", 220-pound center, if you can believe that. And in those days, that was small. Today, that would be a big guard.
Yeah, that's right. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, and Alvin was known for being a great passer, a really good outside shooter, and having great quickness. So when he and Westphal got to the Summer League that year, and they just lit it up on fire, there was a real sense that the Suns could be onto something. And Westphal went on to become a first-team All-NBA guard for a couple of years. I think part of the reason that you mentioned that he's not better known and better remembered is that his prime was really pretty short. He didn't play a lot in his first couple of years in Boston, and then he had injuries after he left Phoenix. The Suns traded him to Seattle for Dennis Johnson. And he immediately got hurt. And then he was hurt when he played for the Knicks. And by the time he came back to the Suns in 1984, he really was a shadow of what he had been. But for a couple of years, from 1976, say, to 1980, he was as good a guard as there was in the league. He was really amazing. And Alvin was Rookie of the Year. He famously said when he received the trophy, I think he was the 5th pick in the draft, something like that. He said, "I'd like to thank my teammates, I'd like to thank my coach, and I'd like to thank David Thompson for going to the ABA." It was the last year of the ABA, and David Thompson, who was the best college player in the country, had signed a contract in Denver. He was also a pretty funny guy, a good face for the franchise, and he became the face of the franchise for the next 13 years. He was the Suns' mainstay. He never had as good a season as he did that first year, but he was key to everything the Suns liked to do, which was run, fast break, move the ball around quickly and well, and he was the key to all that.
It's great to hear those sort of recollections. And we'll jump forward for a minute because this is relevant to Alvin Adams particularly, because you were working with the Phoenix Suns as far as you were asked to do a podcast series that has one of the great names that I've ever heard. Orange, you glad you listened. You probably know I love my wordplay.
Yes.
That's one of the best titles I've ever heard for a podcast, let alone just something in general. So congratulations to whoever came up with that. Is that your work or somebody else's?
The same friend who got me on the baseline for that Bulls game later went to work for the Suns. And he's the one I did the podcast with, and I think that was his invention.
Stroke of genius. So congratulate him next time you're speaking to him.
I will.
Thanks. Do you mind just talking a little bit about the episodes that you did at that time? You interviewed Alvin Adams. He was one of the guests. You very kindly shared a link to that conversation because I don't think that files are now available online as such. They might be somewhere in the deep recesses of the internet, but just some great conversations that the two of you had with some all-time greats of the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, it was really fun. My friend Steve suggested this podcast to his bosses that ran the digital side, the website for the Suns. And they thought it was a good idea to talk to people associated with the Suns in years past and even in the present at that time. And I, of course, was thrilled to talk to anybody who had played for the Suns back in the day. Mm-hmm. So we talked to guys like Alvin Adams. We talked to Walter Davis. We talked to Connie Hawkins. We talked to John McLeod. We talked to all sorts of people. And we did, I think, about 10 or 12 of them. It was wonderful to hear those stories firsthand from the people who actually lived them, and to get a sense of what it was like to be in the locker room and on the court in those days. It was an experience I'll really treasure.
Yeah, they're great memories, and I thank you for sharing some of those episodes with me because I think you sent me 4 or 5, and I just was riveted listening to those conversations as well. So I felt like I was in the room there with you guys, just chatting to those guys, via the phone or whatever connections you had at that stage.
I tend to do a lot of babbling in those podcasts because I'm so excited. It's kind of like the old Chris Farley Saturday Night Live sketch where he's a talk show host. He has Paul McCartney on. He says, "Remember that time you were in the Beatles? That was great." That was kind of what I did in those podcasts. But we managed to get some good stories out of the guys anyway.
That's awesome, mate. I babble on a fair bit too, so I end up editing a bit out so that it comes out sounding at least half decent. So we get there after a while.
Better than half.
Yeah, well, thank you. Now, go back to that 1993 season for a minute. We talked about the first round classic matchup against the Lakers. We'll talk a little bit about the 93 finals, one of the great matchups. The Suns had the home court advantage. The Bulls got off to a 2-0 series lead, and then it went back to Chicago for 3. Nobody really thought they'd be returning back to Phoenix, to be honest, and I think Bob Costas even alluded to that as much in one of the NBC broadcasts prior to coming back for Game 6. But what do you recall of the time there in 1993 with the Suns and with family and friends, I guess, in that area as well? What did you sort of make of the whole Phoenix being in the national spotlight and the world spotlight, given how popular basketball was coming off the 1992 Olympics and that following season?
Yeah, well, Barkley single-handedly reinvigorated interest in basketball in Phoenix. There were buses that had billboards on the side of them with his face. There were signs on the sides of buildings saying, "Go Suns." I had never seen the community that energized about the team before, and it was really something. The whole city got behind this team. And when they got to the finals against the Bulls, it was the first time, and the Bulls won those first 2 games, it was the first time the Suns had been underdogs all year. Mm-hmm. So they really, and the community really didn't know what to do. I think the Suns used it as motivation when they went back to Chicago. When the Suns left Phoenix, Kevin Johnson had played so badly in the first 2 games that he got booed. And that never happened to KJ in Phoenix. It was really tough. And there was a sense that the Suns were just overwhelmed by the Bulls. And they went back to Chicago and they won 2 out of 3. And in some part, it's because Paul Westphal switched Kevin Johnson to guard Michael Jordan. As you know, there's like a 6-inch height advantage there.
Yeah.
But KJ was quick enough that he could stay with Michael, where Dan Marley couldn't. And Marley was able to move over to Scottie Pippen, and that really turned things around for the Suns in those games. They won 2 out of 3, one of which was a triple overtime thriller, in which I think Marley set at that time the record for 3-pointers in a game.
Yeah, that's true.
That was the second triple overtime game the Suns had played in the finals in their history. I think they're the only team to play in 2. They're 1-1 in triple overtime games in finals, so if you get into the finals with them, be careful because the Suns have some practice.
They do indeed. They'd win 2 of 3 in Chicago and then would come back to Phoenix to play that Game 6, which of course has that incredible finish, depending on who you ask, I guess. Incredible for Chicago fans, not so much.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah, great. Really excited for you.
And not so much for anybody in the Valley of the Sun. However, what did you make of that Game 6 matchup and your memories of the game at that time? And even when we look back on it all these years on, 23 years ago, It's crazy to think it was that long ago, that experience.
I was living in Austin, Texas at the time. I was in graduate school. And so I was watching the games on television. And there are no Suns fans in Austin, Texas. They're all about the Spurs down there. So I was watching that game by myself in a pizza parlor. The Suns had a lot of momentum coming back to Phoenix. And there was a sense that this really might be possible. And they came down the stretch in that Game 6 and made some bad mistakes. And Jordan made some great plays. And then there's the famous shot by Paxson that sealed the deal. The Suns had a possession after that, and KJ had a pretty good look at the basket, and Horace Grant came out of nowhere and blocked his shot, and that was it. That was all she wrote. And I think at that point, that was when Barkley said, there's never going to be anybody better than Michael Jordan. He had given it his best shot. He had a fantastic series. He was hurt, too. Barkley had a big wrap on his elbow for a lot of the series. He had hurt it against Seattle, I think. And he still was putting up like 40 and 20 in a game, and he was just going crazy. But it wasn't quite enough. The Bulls just had a little bit too much firepower, and they had the experience in the finals.
What did you think immediately as you saw the final play unfold with KJ grabbing the ball and then putting up what could have been possibly a game-winning attempt before Horace Grant had other ideas? What was sort of going through your mind there, or was it not safe for podcasts?
Honestly, I think Suns fans are trained a little bit from their history to be a little skeptical of the possibility of success. They've come close so many times, then something seems to snatch it away from them every time. That when the Suns had that last possession, there was a part of me that was thinking, this isn't going to happen. I was already, preparing my speech for the non-existent press conference about how great the team had played all year, and I was really proud of them. And so I wasn't surprised when the block happened because I'd seen that kind of thing happen to the Suns a lot. I was sad. I was really, really sad. I was very down. I was not surprised also by the Paxson jumper for the same reason, because stuff like that always seemed to happen to the Suns, and it's happened since. So I wasn't super shocked by it, but I certainly wasn't happy about it.
I think that in the fourth quarter of Game 6, the only Bull that had scored points prior to Paxson's three-pointer was Jordan. He only had maybe 9 points in the fourth quarter, and then Jordan didn't even touch the ball after half court from memory once the ball came up the court. But Paxson's three was the only other point scored by a Bull in that fourth quarter. So, pretty strange circumstances. And unfortunately, on the flip side of the coin, unfortunately for the Suns fans, of course, heartbreak of what could have been, and going to force a deciding Game 7 still back at home as well, which could have been very interesting had the series extended that far. But, of course, it ended at that point there, unfortunately.
Well, we talked about the Suns' reception that they got when they came back from Boston in the 76 finals and all those people at the airport.
Mm-hmm.
The Suns held a parade after the finals that year against the Bulls, and 200,000 people showed up.
Incredible.
And I don't know if you've ever been to Phoenix in June.
No.
It's not cold. It was well over 100, and there were plenty of people there. 200,000, and just showing their love for the franchise and for what they had accomplished that year. It was a really special team, and it was a special time because Barkley came to a team that was already formed. Those were guys that had essentially grown up as players in Phoenix, so there was a sense of ownership to that team. And then Barkley came in and led them, much in the same way that Moses Malone led the Sixers in '83 to the finals, just with an unhappier result.
No, it's great to hear your recollections of this, and obviously you know the history of the franchise so well over many decades as well. So it's just fantastic to chat about it from all this way across the other side of the world. From me in Australia, yourself, you're in LA, aren't you?
I'm in Los Angeles, yeah.
Appreciate your time. I don't want to hold you up forever, but a couple of quick questions before we wrap it up, mate.
Sure.
Earlier in the chat, I referred to you as a true super fan of the Phoenix Suns. Do you mind just elaborating a little bit on that moniker and a 2006 trip to Italy that you had planned?
Right.
And I say that with inverted commas around the word planned. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, or that's to be kept under wraps?
Sure. No, I'm happy to talk about that. My friend who worked for the Suns introduced me to a lot of his colleagues there. So I knew pretty much the whole web department, including my friend Jeremy McPeak, who ran the department at that time. He's the Suns vice president now. Jeremy's a great guy. So when I heard that the Suns were going to go to Europe for their training camp in 2006, I saw it as a possible opportunity. So I called up my friends at the Suns, and I lied through my teeth. I said, hey, just so happens I'm going to be in Italy at the same time, which was not true. I said, can I stop by training camp, and is there any way I can help out? And they said, that's great, free labor. So they said, sure, we'll make sure that you get into the practices in Italy. So I flew there with a friend from high school, my friend Robert Weber, and we somehow found our way to Treviso, where the Suns were having their training camp at this great stadium out in the middle of nowhere. And we walked in, and there were the Steve Nash Suns practicing. They held a clinic for kids from the local Air Force Base, which was great fun. Bill Russell was there.
Wow.
And everybody treated us very nicely. I got some quotes for the Suns website. That was my job while I was there, was to stand there with a little digital recorder and hold it in front of Mike D'Antoni and say, hey, are the Suns going to be good this year? Basically, that was my job. But I got to talk to Sean Marion and Amari Stoudemire and Steve Nash. And it was just great. It was great to feel like part of the organization. It got to the point where we were only there for a couple of days, where we would see the players and the coaches in the town square or at restaurants, and they would say hello to you. So that was a lot of fun. And I came back home, and I wrote a recollection of the trip. And I sent it to the Suns. I said, maybe you could use this for the website. And they did. And they were happy enough with it that they asked me to write a column for the website whenever I wanted, just write about being a fan of the Suns, whether it was recollections of the Suns or thoughts about the Suns of the day, whatever. It was up to me. And they said it was a super fan column. And so that's how I got the moniker as far as the organization was concerned. And I wrote a blog for them for off and on about 6 years.
Yeah.
Every time the Suns came to town, I would go see them. I would write about whatever was going on with the team. When I was in Phoenix, I would stop by the stadium and I would meet some of the players and sometimes talk to them and get their perspective and get them included in some of the columns. It was a lot of fun. It was really great fun to be part of it for a little while.
Yeah, it sounds like a dream really at that stage, doesn't it? So
yeah,
that would have been 30 years pretty much to the year since you first sort of fell in love with the franchise. So they couldn't get somebody who was more diehard of a fan, I guess, to be involved with that. So that must have been pretty special too.
The only person they might have gotten that was more involved was my father-in-law. And he was the second ever season ticket holder for the Phoenix Suns.
Oh, wow.
If you ask him, he might have been the first, but probably he was the second. And he had season tickets for the Suns for 45 years.
Oh, incredible.
So he's been there since day one.
Wow. So your links and family links are going right back to when the franchise was first established.
That's right.
Just a quick side story there. Mike D'Antoni, he's got some big-time links to Europe as well after his playing days in America, based himself in Europe for quite some time before returning back to the States.
He actually played for the team that was based out of Treviso, Italy, which was where the Suns had their training camp.
I was wondering if there was some sort of link there because I knew once you said D'Antoni and I realised you're talking about Italy, that's why it sort of clicked in my mind. I better make mention of that too.
He was the biggest star there. Everywhere he went, he was hailed as a superhero. Steve Nash, MVP, Everybody was happy to see him, but Mike D'Antoni was back. And so he was cheered everywhere he went. And I think Vinny Del Negro had also played for that team. He was working for the Suns front office at that time. So he was welcomed back with open arms too. It was kind of fun to see.
Goodwill developed, of course, from the other side of the world as well, which is great.
Yeah.
So we'll wrap it up, mate, just by asking one more question about your current job. You talked about how you're doing some writing for the Suns, for the best part of 6 or so years on and off. I believe now you do some freelance writing and your day job is involved with writing comics and doing cartoons and things like that. What sort of stuff does that involve?
Well, right now I'm writing for the latest Transformers cartoon.
Sweet.
So I'm spending my days coming up with reasons for robots to hit other robots. It's called Transformers Robots in Disguise. It's on Cartoon Network, and it's a pretty fun show. We just got nominated for an Emmy.
Oh, congratulations. Good on you.
So we're excited about that. And it's really been a lot of fun getting a chance to be part of another franchise that's been around for decades and getting to learn about the history of that and meet all the people who have been involved. So that's my day job these days. But I still spend most of my off hours rooting for the Suns, even though this has not been the best year.
That's why I've deliberately steered clear of 2016, mate. So didn't want to go there for you.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
I'm very excited about the draft.
As a few teams are, I'm sure. My brother, actually, I think I might have mentioned this in an email. My brother Luke is a massive Transformers fan. He's been a big fan of the franchise since the original animated movie back in whatever that was, 1980 something.
Yeah.
So he loves his Transformers. So he'll be pleased to hear this little tidbit that you're involved with the modern day writing of it too, mate. So thanks again for just chatting with me for this period of time, mate. It's been a great trip down memory lane and specifically focusing in on the Phoenix Suns franchise. Is there anywhere online at all that people could follow your movements or whatever you're up to? Or
I have my own website at adambeechin.com. I don't update it as frequently as I probably should, but if you want to find out about stuff that I've been doing and stuff that I'm doing now, the website has it. It's got links to all the comic books I've written, and it'll tell you about the shows that I've written for, too.
Good stuff, mate. I'll include links to that for what it's worth in the show notes to this episode. But thanks again for being a part of the show, mate, and hope to bring you back at some stage in the future.
When the Suns win the championship. Next year. Next year. Thanks for having me, and keep up the good work. It's really a great podcast.
Oh, I appreciate it, mate. That's very kind of you, and thanks again for having time to chat today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. Suggest topics or guests you want to hear conversations with. You can leave a voicemail. Simply visit inallairness.com/voice. Click start recording, leave a message and press stop. You can even listen back before submitting. Press send and you're done. Worldwide, the show currently has 57 reviews, 54 on iTunes and 3 on Stitcher. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Word-of-mouth recommendations are certainly worth their weight in gold. You can subscribe to my show in various ways. iTunes, visit inallairness.com/review. Add it to your Stitcher playlist, inallairness.com/Stitcher. You can also subscribe on Pocket Casts, Player FM, Overcast, TuneIn Radio, other podcatchers, and of course via the Podcasts app on your iOS device of choice. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter at inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.